In Rome, 4 centuries ago, a painter began to create one of the most dramatic religious images of that or any era.
We have a very powerful sense that this is a real scene, that we're looking through a window onto the nocturnal, mean streets of Rome. We might be witnessing a fight in the street, men screaming at each other, this eruption of violence.
The artist's name was Caravaggio. Working in a way that defied convention, he gradually brought the darkest of visions into being.
It's a scene of the world gone askew. Christ captured and treated and betrayed exactly like a common criminal.
The subject is the arrest of Jesus, the moment when the Son of God is betrayed with a kiss. And it is portrayed in a realistic manner never seen before.
You have this almost stoical figure of Christ. He stands up against this great surge of arresting soldiers. He's the one solid figure in this composition.
In its day, this was one of the most costly and celebrated of all artworks. But its fame fell away, and in a confusion of discarded fashions and lost fortunes, a work of genius disappeared without trace. 2 centuries later, an amazing combination of detective work and coincidence would uncover its turbulent history and return a masterpiece to the world. In the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin, there's no doubting which work takes pride of place. At the end of a long vista, a compelling image of dark and light, of struggle and grace, draws visitors inexorably towards it. The painting shows the taking of Christ, one of the most disturbing episodes in the New Testament. And the manner in which the scene is depicted is among the most striking and affecting in Western art.
When you look at this painting, you don't respond to it as a scene from the Bible. You respond to it as a man being arrested. You respond to it as an arrest that's taking place before your eyes, a violent, disturbing scene which is actually happening at night and you're there. No artist has ever made the darker side of the Christian story so alive.
It is night in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is the first violent event of Christ's passion, the chain of events that will lead to his crucifixion. It's a moment of supreme confusion when God made man is arrested by worldly powers.
It's a scene of violence. Christ is betrayed. Some sweaty man appears in the midst of a mob and attempts to kiss him. There is this abrupt, startling, violent movement. We feel that this is as confused as those moments in our own lives when we have been jostled in a crowd or, heaven forbid, a melee, a violent outburst of our own.
The troubling events portrayed are related in all 4 Gospels.
And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves. Now he that betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Hold him fast. And forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master, and kissed him. Then came they and laid hands on Jesus and took him. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled.
The painting portrays the key moments of the drama, compacted in time and space, drawing the viewer into the action and its huge significance.
We take the close-up for granted because of film and television, but at this moment, he's using it to make these stories vividly alive. He wants to push the action right up so that we're right there as the kiss comes, as we feel it and we see the intense reaction of Judas, that chilling expression, that expression of almost madness in his eyes.
The lighting is stark. Faces, hands, and the sheen of the armor stand out against the symbolic blackness of the night.
The darkness in this scene is theological in character. In the Gospel of St. John, the evangelist said, "And it was night," in the Latin that Caravaggio's age would have known, et erat nox, with Judas implementing the betrayal. A kind of night falls around him, falls around Christ, falls around our human nature.
At the edge of the crowd, a man holds a lantern to help pierce the darkness. He is neither a soldier in contemporary armor nor a biblical character in classical robes. In fact, we know precisely who he is. 31 years old, he is the man who painted this picture. This is a self-portrait of Michelangelo Merisi, better known as Caravaggio. Caravaggio was born in 1571 in Milan, and at the age of 12, he was apprenticed to a local artist. He would learn his craft in a city in the grip of a religious fever, with art at the center of the upheaval. Church leaders believed that over centuries, religious art had lost its sense of sacred purpose and become mere decoration. Now they demanded a new directness that would stress the physical truth of the Christian message. What emerged in Milan was a dark and imposing realism, a style that Caravaggio would bring to perfection in the taking of Christ. In the hills above the city, the church took its desire for holy realism further, to a radical extent. Sacri Monti, or sacred mountains, were built as places of pilgrimage, and the young Caravaggio would have understood their purpose perfectly: to use art to bring Christ's last days vividly and disturbingly alive to ordinary people.
The pilgrim looked through the grating and saw, in the depth of the chapel, a sculptural group, statues in life-size painted terracotta. The realism was carried to the point of giving many of them actual hair wigs. You were meant to lose that sense of clear distinction between art and reality. You were meant to feel that you were right there.
In a chapel at the sacred mountain of Varallo, St. John laments at the foot of the cross. His hands rest in their traditional arrangement, a representation of grief and anguish. It's exactly the gesture that Caravaggio's Christ will make. One scene always depicted powerfully in the chapels of the sacred mountains was the betrayal of Christ. But before Caravaggio could produce his revolutionary version, he would have to travel hundreds of miles south, to where the artistic action of the day was really happening. Rome in the 1590s was a vibrant city of contradictions, of cardinals and demobbed soldiers, of pilgrims and prostitutes.
Rome is the place for an artist to be at this moment because it is the center of Catholic Christendom. People are drawn from all over the world, and there's an immensely cosmopolitan and sophisticated atmosphere in Rome at this moment. It was a very competitive environment for painters as well, because there were a lot of good ones working at this time.
Caravaggio arrived in Rome as a 20-year-old unknown. His early works were far from holy and sold on the open market to any buyer who came along. The artistic breakthrough that led to the painting of the Taking of Christ came in 1599, when Caravaggio received a major public commission. It was the first time the artist had depicted the adult Christ, and the result would be a revolutionary new kind of religious art.
Caravaggio became famous overnight with everyone in Rome with the Contarelli Chapel pictures in 1599-1600. This was something totally unprecedented. These realistic figures, dramatic contrasts of light and shade looming forward in the space of the chapel as if they're actually there. He wants to have arms that break through the picture plane, showing that these figures can really impinge on the space of the viewer. He wants to make certain bits rather ugly to show that these aren't idealized classical figures. The apostles were humble fishermen, so right, let's use a model who's an ordinary figure with tattered clothing.
The chapel paintings made Caravaggio the talk of Rome. But despite the success, dark clouds were gathering around the artist. Caravaggio was developing a taste for trouble. He was involved in street scuffles and gang violence, and would wind up in court and prison more than once. But such worldly experience would serve him well when the time came to paint his sacred masterpiece.
Roma in quegli anni, tra la fine del 5 e del 600, era una città molto turbolente.
Rome in those years was a turbulent and dangerous city, especially at night. There were regular patrols of the papal guards who were charged with stopping and arresting people. So the taking of Christ, with all those armed men, becomes the arrest of an outlaw, a scene that Caravaggio is recalling firsthand.
Caravaggio rivive quasi in prima persona.
For all his unruliness, Caravaggio was now the most famous painter in Rome, with no shortage of wealthy patrons. In 1601, he moved into the palatial home of the city's richest family, the Mattei. They occupied a whole block of the capital. Only the Pope retained more servants. It was while living in the Mattei Palace that Caravaggio created the Taking of Christ. Two of the family in particular helped shape the painting: Girolamo Mattei, who was a cardinal, and his brother Ciriaco, an art collector and connoisseur.
Ciriaco Mattei was one of the great patrons in Rome at this moment, the kind of collector that an artist living today would love to see, to place a painting in this collection, because it's going to be noticed by truly sophisticated people.
Within his household, Ciriaco was creating an artist's dream environment. His collection of antique sculpture, expensive and newly fashionable, displayed Rome's former artistic glories. Some elements, like the billowing robes on sarcophagus stones, may even have found their way into the Taking of Christ. But first, Ciriaco would commission Caravaggio to paint another scene from the Easter story, virtually a companion piece,
The Supper at Emmaus represents Christ on Resurrection Day, his appearance to the apostles, the confirmation that he was truly risen. And it balances beautifully with the taking of Christ and the moment at which the Passion in earnest truly begins. Caravaggio depicts Christ as young. This isn't the bearded 33-year-old who was crucified 3 days before. He doesn't show any signs of the Passion. You have these gestures with outflung arms, and then you go to the taking of Christ and you've got the fleeing apostle whose arms are also outflung, his mouth also open, but it becomes an expression of absolute terror as opposed to absolute surprise and joy.
Ciriaco was clearly delighted with his new Easter painting, and now asked Caravaggio to paint another. But this was a tougher challenge, a nocturnal scene of panic and betrayal. It was a subject that had obsessed artists for centuries.
Caravaggio is not the only Italian artist who's very, very moved and fascinated by the strangeness of Judas betraying Christ with a kiss. It's very Italian, actually. If you think about it, it's the kind of thing that Martin Scorsese would put in a film. Giotto has him kissing Christ, full on the lips. And the look in Christ's eyes is one of sort of, yeah, I know who you are, and I know what you've done. It can be a very big, complex scene. You can have a lot more soldiers in the scene. A lot of artists include St. Peter with his dagger trying to fight back against the soldiers. Caravaggio just pares all that back. He gets rid of everything that isn't emotional. He focuses in relentlessly on the emotional core of the story.
It was now 1602. In a studio in the Mattei Palace, Caravaggio set to work on the taking of Christ. Exactly how he painted it is still the subject of intense debate.
People are fascinated by Caravaggio's technique. There's a mystique about it. He seems to have had a secret that people don't understand. Certainly at the time, it was a revelation to his contemporaries. And even now, you can look at his paintings and find it difficult to put into words or explain to people quite how he achieved some of these effects. There are little secrets about his technique, little tricks, little quirks, or whatever you call them, that appear to be absolutely unique to him.
A close study of the taking of Christ can reveal some of those secrets and show how the artist might have created this remarkable image. At virtually every stage, he defied received wisdom, even when applying the base layer of paint, the ground.
The first thing Caravaggio would have done would be to prepare the canvas for painting. And what he would have done that very few artists, if any, had done before was to use a dark ground. People specifically were warned against this. The 16th century manuals for painting said, use a pale ground, possibly flesh-coloured. The darker your ground, the muddier your colours. Your painting will die, your colours will not glow. But Caravaggio went completely against that and decided that he could paint onto a dark ground, and it allowed him to build up shadows in the simplest and effective manner and create these incredible dramatic contrasts between areas of light and shade.
Most artists of the time would base their design on a preparatory sketch, worked up carefully before putting brush to canvas. Caravaggio seems not to have made such sketches, preferring to work from live studio models. But his arrangement of models was carefully planned and did draw on the work of earlier artists. A key source of inspiration was a century-old woodcut by the German artist Albrecht Dürer.
There's a dearth of evidence as to how he actually decided on what he was going to put on, how he finalized the design. In this instance, of course, we know that the Dürer shows a very similar figure group of Christ and Judas and the soldier. The arms are in the same place, and Caravaggio obviously saw this and thought, That's the germ of an idea, but he's expanded that. But it seems to me that he would have got the models, people he probably knew, and at the point of arranging them, that's when he would have finalized the tensions, the disposition of the figures, the entire impact of the composition.
It is almost certain that there were never 7 models in the studio at the same time. But in the early stages, Caravaggio might well have worked with small groups.
If you can get your hands first in that rather stressed position, pushing downwards, that's very good, actually. I think that really is quite convincing, that you could achieve, potentially, the same composition, or very close to it, with 3 figures in real space. It would work. It would definitely work. How long you can hold that pose, I'm not entirely sure.
With his models in position, Caravaggio would have plotted his design directly onto the canvas, in broad brushstrokes. It was a daringly rapid method, yet only one significant rethink seems to have occurred. The faint outline of a second ear shows that Judas's head was originally higher. The design sketched in, Caravaggio would call his models back, perhaps in 1s or 2s, to add the detail.
It's perfectly feasible that he could paint a head in half an hour or less. That would be absolutely what you'd expect for a live model to stay put. And he could probably ask the model to take a certain expression and then quickly capture that and then allow them to relax for a bit. I keep thinking that the head of Judas, he must have got very tired of frowning by the time he'd finished.
But if posing for Judas was tough, one other job must have been even more demanding.
It's very, very difficult to make an armor look like there's someone inside it when there's not. I don't think, however, propping it with sticks or whatever he might have done, it would have worked. There's got to be a model in there. And that model, incidentally, would have to have been a pretty patient person, because one of the most painful, difficult things to do in armor is to stand perfectly still.
The beautiful, sinister jet-black armor dominates the painting. The reflections on its gleaming surface show the play of light and dark, known as chiaroscuro, so characteristic of the artist. There are several early accounts of Caravaggio's working methods, and on one thing all sources seem to agree, that he worked in a dark room, perhaps even a cellar, with a strong source of directed light. A landlady once took Caravaggio to court for knocking a hole in the ceiling of his room, presumably to allow a shaft of light to slant down across his models.
There is a huge fascination with how Caravaggio used light and how he controlled light. And theories abound as to whether it was sunlight falling through a window, whether it was artificial light. If it was artificial light, how did he arrange it? So that the light on the armor, for example, seems to be coming from behind the viewer and bouncing straight back. The light on Caravaggio himself, his face, seems to come from the lantern, directional light from the center, but the light falling on Christ and Judas is very much like a spotlight or a maybe moonlight or maybe ethereal divine light, in fact, coming down from the upper left. And you cannot make this work in real space. You have to assume that he was working with individual people, one at a time, without any necessary regard for a totally believable physical system of lighting.
But it's one thing to set up an effect of light, another thing entirely to capture it accurately.
One of the last things that he may have done was to apply things like the highlight to the armor, putting it just down the center of each of these areas of low reflection to give that focused quality that you get off highly polished and presumably, I don't know, oiled armor. Once you've got the skill to do it, you can achieve it incredibly quickly with a well-placed stroke. But it would probably take many years of practice to know exactly where to place that stroke.
There were few late changes to the Taking of Christ. The finished work is almost exactly as Caravaggio must have imagined it. He even makes use of his original painted layer, the dark ground. It's left exposed to give rich skin tones in areas such as the hand of Judas.
When you've studied one of his paintings over some weeks, as I have, and then tried to emulate it, it's quite jaw-dropping, I think, how he achieves some of the effects in paint, how he translates light, dark, shadow into paint in such an efficient and simple manner, apparently, but incredibly difficult to emulate.
The Taking of Christ may have taken Caravaggio as little as a month to paint, but he was paid for his genius, not his time. He received 125 scudi, making this one of the most expensive paintings of its day. He was a famed artist working at the height of his powers, and he had produced a masterpiece. The Taking of Christ would remain in the Mattei family for 2 centuries, in the very palaces for which it was made. But for its maker, things would not end so happily. This was the last painting he would create for the Mattei. Soon after finishing it, and in trouble with the law again, he left their home. His behavior grew more erratic, and in 1606 he killed a man in a street fight. He fled Rome under sentence of death and spent the rest of his life moving from town to town, painting ever darker and more troubled scenes. He died in an obscure coastal town, aged just 38. The Taking of Christ, meanwhile, passed down the Mattei line from father to son to cousin, moving from room to room in the family palaces. For a long time it was a prized possession, the envy even of wealthy friends.
Caravaggio was very sought after. He was all the rage and everybody wanted his paintings. Aristocrats coming to the Mattei Palace would see the works by Caravaggio, and some of them may have wanted one too. And in an era without photographs, the only way to get a copy would be to commission a copy. And the more famous a work was, the more copies were likely to be made.
So dozens of copies of The Taking of Christ were made, at least one for the Mattei themselves. Some were well executed, others less so. But artistic fashions began to change, and within just 50 years, Caravaggio's art had fallen spectacularly from grace. The Age of Enlightenment wanted classical ideals, not dirty realism.
Art was supposed to be edifying. It should not be dark and too earthy looking and too natural. Christ was a paradigm of virtue, and so Christ must look ideally handsome because that would reflect the state of his soul. Obviously, Caravaggio's style did not fit with that way of thinking.
Once among the most celebrated and costly of paintings, The Taking of Christ was gradually being forgotten. In 1793, an inventory of the Mattei's possessions was taken. The Taking of Christ was listed not as a Caravaggio, but as the work of a then more fashionable Dutch artist, Gerard van Honthorst. It may have been a simple mistake, or the Mattei family may have been seeking to increase the painting's value. Whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. The painting vanished from the Mattei collection and dropped out of sight. Shorn of its true identity, it would prove impossible to trace. A great masterpiece was lost, seemingly forever. Dublin, 1990. On a warm August morning, an art restorer set out from his studio at the National Gallery of Ireland. He was an Italian with a lifelong passion for Caravaggio, but Sergio Benedetti's career was treading water, and he'd landed up in Ireland, the fringes of the art world. Benedetti was on his way to a house of Jesuit priests on Leeson Street, just 500 yards from his workplace. The Jesuits had some paintings in need of attention. What happened next would cast Benedetti as the hero of one of the most extraordinary detective stories in the history of art.
I wanted Sergio Benedetti to come because we had a painting which I believe was by Honthorst, and we would like to have that restored if possible. We brought him up to the room, and Sergio looked at the painting very intently. And then Sergio turned and said, "Oh yes, we should have that restored."
The fathers had long known that this was not just any old painting. It was by Gerard van Honthorst, as its label said. But Benedetti, with a restorer's instinct, saw something far more thrilling under the grime.
When I saw the picture, I immediately thought, this is a copy after Caravaggio. Then I moved closer to the paintings. And looking more carefully at the paintings, I saw the quality of brushwork. And the excitement grew on me. It was a tremendous excitement.
Sergio Benedetti had reason to be excited. He'd grown up alongside an extraordinary revival in Caravaggio's fortunes. In Italy after the war, hard times saw a new taste for ragged realism emerge in literature and cinema. Caravaggio's art spoke to people's experience, and his works were once again hailed as masterpieces. In 1951, the first major exhibition of the artist's work was held in Milan, but missing was the taking of Christ. The best the organizers could show was one of the early copies. Now Benedetti thought he might have stumbled upon the original, some 500 yards from his workplace. It seemed too good to be true. Within 3 days, the painting had been collected and brought to Benedetti's restoration studio in the National Gallery. It was the first chance for the gallery's director to see the work.
My initial reaction was, I wasn't totally convinced at the time. It's the kind of thing that you always think happens somewhere else, that Dublin, it's a backwater and nothing like this could happen in Dublin. And we could be very embarrassing, especially if it turned out that it wasn't Caravaggio. So while we weren't convinced, there was enough there to say, but it's still worth pursuing. And therefore we gave him a green light to go ahead and follow up on investigating the painting, its origins and all of that.
Some problems were visible on the surface with the flaking parts of the painting and other things of the kind. The picture was covered by 3 or 4 coats of alter varnish. The varnish were created on the surface like a yellow-brown filter. The cleaning came out extremely well. You immediately saw that the colors were so vibrant, so exceptionally beautiful.
Sergio Benedetti's excitement was rising. In secret, the painting was sent to the laboratories of the National Gallery in London and subjected to a technical examination. Pigment samples confirmed that the paints used were typical of Caravaggio, and X-rays showed his telltale technique. All the physical evidence was pointing to the fact that this was the missing masterpiece. But the authentication process also required an explanation of where it had been. How on earth had a priceless Caravaggio come to be adorning the walls of a religious meeting house in Dublin?
doubts that they were at any moment. And exactly because he seems so lucky to have just only 500 yards distant the discovery of a work of such importance.
For Benedetti, answering the question became a personal mission, lasting 3 years and leading him all over Europe. The trail began in the archives in Rome. There, documents revealed that in 1802, the Mattei family, burdened by heavy taxes, had sold 6 paintings. Among them was the Taking of Christ, attributed, sure enough, to Gerard van Honthorst. The buyer conveniently left his name, William Hamilton Nisbet.
William Hamilton Nisbet was the great-grandfather of my great-great-uncle. He was an MP 3 times, I think, for the area. And the inheritance in East Lothian was a very large chunk of the breadbasket of Scotland. He was a great collector of art. Clearly he had an eye for these things, and there was probably a lot to play with in terms of resources.
In 1802, William Hamilton Nisbet visited Rome specifically to buy artworks, and he selected 6 of the very best from the Mattei family collection. The export license shows that the Taking of Christ cost him 150 scudi. In reality, he paid 4 times that, but was looking to avoid taxes. Back home, Nisbet had all his new paintings reframed and moved to his grand country house in the east of Scotland. The Taking of Christ, still attributed to Van Honthorst, was destined for the dining room, but not in the position of honour it had enjoyed in its heyday.
It's hung there at one end of the room, surrounded by an extraordinary amount of other pictures. You have to look very closely to see it, and it in some ways comes out through the reflection of the armour. I suspect that they didn't recognise it as being the extraordinary picture it is. It was very dirty and grimy, and the varnish was yellowing, so maybe at the time it didn't really sing out like it does now.
Generations passed, and in 1921, the direct Hamilton-Nisbet line came to an end when the last of the family, Constance, died childless. The Taking of Christ had no home, and could quite easily have become part of the collection of the National Gallery of Scotland.
We were offered a selection from the family collection, but we opted not to go for the painting now recognised to be by Caravaggio. Instead, the gallery opted to accept the picture you can see hanging very high on the wall over there by an artist called Giovanni Serodine, who was really unknown. Well, 120 years later it might have been different, but...
Rejected by one and all, the Taking of Christ, with its majestic early history, came to suffer a gross indignity. On the 16th of April 1921, it went up for sale in a minor auction at Dowell's of Edinburgh. In the catalogue, it failed even to retain its attribution to Van Honthorst. It's listed only as after Van Honthorst. The Dowell's records record the blunt facts. Unremarked among other items, many of them more expensive, the Taking of Christ sold. The price was rather less than 30 pieces of silver, 8 guineas. The buyer, one John Kemp of Rose Street. Like the painting he'd acquired, Kemp was not all that he seemed.
John Kemp was my father's business name. He was running a successful George Street gallery under the name of J. Kent Richardson, RSW. My own simple theory is that when he was selling a good painting in his gallery, he would be presenting himself as J. Kent Richardson. But if he were buying and selling through auctions or house sales, it would be Kemp.
The taking of Christ had fallen into the hands of a rather colourful character. Joseph Kent Richardson was a former boxer turned artist and dealer, a man who was married twice and arrested once for perjury. And in 1921, he was suffering the art dealer's nightmare, in possession of a masterpiece, and he didn't know it. Keeping his stock moving, Kent Richardson sold on The Taking of Christ. Exactly who bought the painting could not be discovered. The records kept their secrets, and here the Scottish trail went cold. But back in Dublin, there was another line of inquiry to follow. By now, Sergio Benedetti had enough evidence to reveal to the Jesuit fathers what he suspected they had on their hands. It was time to pay another visit to Leeson Street.
When I got up out of my chair to welcome him, he said, "Now sit down, I've got news for you. You won't be able to take standing up." So I sat down, and really at the back of my mind then was, he's going to tell me that it's not a Honthorst, and which was true to a part. But then he said, it's not a Honthorst, it's a Caravaggio. And I knew sufficient about art to know that this was something extremely important. And so he was right. I was absolutely shocked, but shocked in that delightful way, when you get very, very good news.
The Jesuits took a vow of silence, agreeing to keep the news secret until Benedetti had uncovered the full history of the painting. Hurrying to check their records, they found, frustratingly, no written details of how the painting came to be in the house. But some of the fathers had long memories, and their recollections held the key.
There was a priest, and he had been here from, I think, the mid-40s into the 60s, and he knew the story of the painting and how it got there. This was a painting that was given to a member of the community by Marie Lee Wilson.
Marie was an Irish woman who in 1914 had married Percival Lee Wilson, an English policeman working in the Royal Irish Constabulary. The painting's past held one extraordinary final secret: Percival Lee Wilson's own Easter story, one that was tragic and bloody.
At Easter 1916, a group of Irish Republicans took over the General Post Office and other public buildings. And they held out for about a week. And by the end of the week, they surrendered. And so a large group of prisoners was taken away under the command of Captain Lee Wilson. When they got to the Rotunda Hospital, they stopped the group moving on. Lee Wilson humiliated the prisoners, particularly a man named Tom Clark, whom he made strip naked. So obviously they had thoughts in their mind afterwards as how to right this humiliation.
4 years later, in 1920, Percival Lee Wilson was leading a quiet life as a district police inspector in the market town of Gorey. One day he walked out to buy a morning paper. He never returned home. He was shot down by IRA gunmen lying in wait. He left behind Marie, a widow at the age of 32. Marie was convinced of her husband's blamelessness. To her, he was a wronged innocent whose fate echoed that of Christ. She chose to commemorate him with a stained glass window in their local church. The artist was to be Harry Clark, one of the best in Ireland. But at the time, he was at work not in Ireland, but across the water in Scotland.
She went to Scotland to meet the artist, to arrange for this commission. During that weeks that she was in Scotland, she had the opportunity to see the Caravaggio paintings. The drama in the scene of the taking of Christ struck a particular chord in her heart. And she decided to purchase the picture and brought it back to Dublin.
The Taking of Christ, the ultimate portrayal of innocence betrayed, had found a new owner and a new personal significance.
In one sense, it drips with blood. The scene, of course, relates to the Passion of Christ, which ultimately, ended with the crucifixion. And also its association with Dr. Mary Lee Wilson and her own tragic story. So it has a very dark side to it, rather somber side to it.
In Dublin, Mary Lee Wilson began to train as a doctor and rebuild her life. Religion was a great consolation to her, and she formed a strong bond with Father Tom Finlay, a Jesuit living in the Leeson Street residence. He became her confessor and mentor. Marie gave the Taking of Christ, still thought to be by Van Honthorst, to Father Finlay. It was a gift to the Jesuit household that had helped her through her darkest days. There it was to hang for decades, unremarked upon, until that fateful day when Sergio Benedetti first came to call. The Jesuit fathers, deciding that they held the painting in trust for Marie Lee Wilson, opted not to sell it for tens of millions of pounds. Instead, they agreed to give it on permanent loan to the National Gallery of Ireland. It had taken 3 years to uncover the painting's history, and now it was time to reveal the lost Caravaggio. The unveiling in November 1993 made headlines around the world. Sergio Benedetti's achievement was hailed, and he became a full-time art historian. Experts and the public alike flocked to the gallery. Ireland had a new artistic jewel, and the world had recovered one of its masterpieces.
I must admit, when I first saw the Caravaggio, I was absolutely knocked out by it. And then, yes, of course, there's a tinge of regret. But the really great thing is that the painting has been rediscovered and we can all enjoy it. We just have to go over to Dublin to do it.
Caravaggio è un pittore raro.
Caravaggio is an exceptional painter, so the rediscovery of a key work, like the Taking of Christ, was an extraordinary event. We all went to Dublin on a pilgrimage.
Well, I go to the gallery, frequently enough. And I would always go down to raise my hat, as it were, to the Caravaggio. I suppose a quiet satisfaction that we did something that was of value.
Since then, the fever the painting generated has burned on. In 2008, the best of the early copies, perhaps the one made for the Mattei themselves, was stolen from a gallery in Russia. The version shown in Milan in the 1950s was sold, and in 2004 proclaimed by its new owner to be a second original, before doubts were expressed. In Dublin, though, the real Taking of Christ rests safe and secure after a troubled life. Painted over 400 years ago, its depiction of innocence besieged by corruption now speaks directly to our own times.
People see so many things that are a lacerating part of our own present moment. Christ becomes the figure of entire populations, a man in whom all of the vulnerability of the unjustly attacked, of those who fall prey to the forces of power, the empire of the shadows, is expressed.
Stay with us on BBC Two for live coverage of the third round on day 3 of the Masters Golf.